Taiwan always wants to be a different China. So be courageous, Taiwanese politicians, and abolish the death penalty.
The institution that opposed abolition the best this time seems to be the Ministry of Justice, and you've worked with them. How do you look at their way of doing? Like they are actually playing the role of debating for not to abolish the death penalty.
That is true, and I'm really disappointed because we started in 2012. We had the first review meeting under the two international covenants on human rights. And the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has an absolute prohibition of torture and other forms of cruel and inhuman treatment and punishment. Now, corporal punishment and capital punishment are classical forms of cruel punishment. So they are absolutely prohibited. And we made these very strong recommendations to the government. And since the Taiwanese government is really very eager to uphold human rights, we were thinking that the government would actually follow our recommendations. And it's primarily the Ministry of Justice that says, no, we are not following the International Review Committee, high-level experts, whom we invite to tell us what are the international human rights standards. We are following what we want to do because our people tell us that we should not abolish the death penalty. It's the totally wrong approach. Taiwan is still violating international human rights, and it's continuing to do so until they will be hopefully stopped by the Constitutional Court.
For the general public here, they would argue that, well, there's a cultural difference. We have this Western international human rights experts coming to Taiwan who might not know about our culture and telling us what to do. That's a very direct kind of a reaction oftentimes when they hear about this argument from Europe or from Western countries. What's your response to that?
It's a totally absurd argument. First, isn't the United States the leading Western power? Doesn't the United States have the death penalty? Who were the first states that abolished the death penalty? They were in Latin America. Isn't that the global South? And then in Europe. The French and the British were the latest in Europe that actually abolished the death penalty. The most convincing case that I have ever read by a court is the one of the South African Constitutional Court, saying the death penalty violates human dignity. And that was not during the apartheid regime, which is the Western one, the white apartheid regime. It was in reaction to the white British and Dutch apartheid regime that the black Africans said, it's our right to human dignity. International human rights, which is not Western, international human rights are United Nations treaties that were adopted by the big majority or all states in the world that say torture is violating human dignity. And therefore, we need to have restorative justice and not revenge justice.
But then looking around, there's death penalty in China, there's death penalty in Japan, and in South Korea, when they don't use it, they still have death penalty there. Don't you see that there's a pattern or there's this East Asian kind of discourse in it?
There are other Asian countries that have abolished the death penalty. Think about Mongolia, for instance. The majority of African states have abolished the death penalty. We have a global trend. We have only a small minority of states that are still applying the death penalty in the world. And this minority is getting smaller and smaller. And at a certain point, China and Taiwan will be the only ones left. I don't think that's good for the reputation of Taiwan. Taiwan always wants to be a different China than the People's Republic of China. They want to be the human rights-minded China. And then they have the death penalty. You cannot reconcile these two. So you have to be avant-garde. You are the first country that allows same-sex marriage. You can again say, yes, that's against Asian values and whatever, but you have done it. So be courageous, Taiwanese politicians, and abolish the death penalty.
For a lot of people, they will think, well, that's the personal choice. But then for death penalty, even young people, there's a high supporting rate because they feel like it's related to everybody. The feeling of safety here. So it's a little bit difference between the two.
We have many empirical studies in the United States and in other countries that show that the crime rate didn't go up after the death penalty was abolished. So it does not have a deterrent effect. It's also a responsibility of the media. I think media form public opinion. And if the media would take the rational arguments, the only argument that is really left is revenge. And that is not in accordance with human rights. We want to treat every human being, even if these people have committed serious crimes, still as a human being with human dignity. That's why the United Nations, not the West, the United Nations, when they established international criminal courts for Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, the General International Criminal Court, and they are there in order to bring to justice the worst criminals, those who commit genocide, wars of aggression, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And even there, it was a clear decision by the United Nations that there should be no death penalty.
Oftentimes, there's a very, again, simple reaction is to, like these criminals, they deserve it. And if we argue for people who in death row, then we neglect the rights of those victims or victims' families.
Don't you think if somebody has committed a very serious crime, that the fact that you kill this person is really giving you a feeling of justice? Is not simply revenge? Even if the worst things would happen to my children or my wife, I would be very angry, I would be very sad. But it doesn't help me if I know that another human being is killed. We don't know what happens with this person. What was his or her childhood? What made him such a criminal? We give him a chance. That's the idea of restorative justice. In prison, you should not simply be isolated in solitary confinement like in the United States of America. You should be educated. You should have the possibility to learn a job, to think about what you did wrong in order to finally be rehabilitated. And then you can be re-socialized into society. That's the form, that's the idea of justice